The gates to the fifth hour were almost anticlimactic. The references Rosie read from the Amduat matched exactly with the symbols carved above the rightmost doorway, and they followed the now slightly shallower channel as it wound along. Frequent turns reminded them that they were tracing their way through a complex maze, and Charlie began to wonder whether his ball of twine would last the entirety of the journey. He refrained from voicing the thought. The party's mood had been quite low following Max's death. Perhaps it was best not to add any more concerns. The underground river started to widen considerably, and Charlie tensed. Another chamber was likely near, and so far each one had been perilous. As if picking up on his thoughts, Rosie looked up from the Amduat and remarked, "We should be approaching an island shortly." He was about to ask what manner of perils they might find there when the island itself hove into view, and the small group stared at it in amazement. It wasn't the size of the island, although it appeared to be about half the width of the channel, but more the object sitting on the island that drew their attention. "A step pyramid," sighed Chatsworth, with wonder in his voice. "Just think of the engineering genius involved, so far underground." Rosie declared, "It's the tomb of Osiris and possibly Isis. We're obviously on track, Charlie, or we wouldn't have arrived here." Charlie was inclined to agree. Although this pyramid was considerably smaller than the tomb at Saqqara, a pyramid was a pyramid, and if Imhotep had included one here, underground, en route to the Tomb of Destiny, there must be a reason for it. "We should go and see if there's anything useful here," he concluded aloud. "Besides, it wouldn't hurt to stretch our legs a little." They paddled up to the island and got out into the water, which at the island's edge was only knee-deep. After securing the boat and collecting some lamps, Charlie and Rosie began to walk over to the pyramid, Chatsworth following more slowly. Sampson hesitated, trying to decide whether to stay with the boat. Then he hurried to catch up with the others. His gun was held tightly with both hands as he peered about, the other one still down his belt in reserve. Charlie smiled at Rosie and then pointed to a strange lump under his jacket. It was the Webley. Charlie had somehow extricated it from his rucksack and he now had it stuffed under his shirt. "Be careful, Charlie," Rosie mouthed to him as they moved onto the island and towards the pyramid. Halfway around the base, they found a doorway leading into a small chamber. Despite being armed, Sampson refused to go in first and look around for any possible perils. "You do it, Waterman." Charlie reluctantly agreed and lifted his lamp to eye level as he bent down and entered the room. For a few minutes, all Rosie could hear were rustling sounds coming from inside the pyramid chamber, which were inconclusive. At least, she thought, she hadn't heard any yelps of pain or animal roaring or, caught up in dire imaginings, she wasn't expecting Charlie's head to pop back out again, and she jumped. He gave her an odd look, but didn't comment on her reaction. "As far as I can tell, it's safe. Come on." The chamber was essentially bare, the walls unornamented. Here and there on the floor were bones, mostly fish and reptile. There were some markings on the walls, but nothing of note. The noises Rosie had heard had been from Charlie pushing the bones around slightly with his foot as he made sure there were no live inhabitants. The walls of the next chamber were also bare, but it held an assortment of canopic jars and statuettes. Small pieces of faience lay scattered in one corner. Attracted by the colors, Sampson made a beeline for them, then turned away in disgust as he realized the bits were relatively worthless. "This appears to be a purely symbolic pyramid," Rosie commented. "It needs to be here as part of the recreation of the underworld, but I don't think we will find anything of value." Charlie had stopped in the doorway to the next chamber, stiffening. "There are some nasty-looking objects in here, all of which appear to be rather sharp." Sampson's ears pricked up. "Sharp as in weaponry?" Charlie kicked himself mentally. They didn't need Sampson getting his hands on more armament. Too late now. Sampson pushed ahead into the second chamber and took control of the scene. Yes, they looked like spears, or maybe pikes. The others followed less precipitously and found Sampson gazing with awe at several long wooden poles stacked against one wall. 8-inch-long knives were fastened to the ends, making for formidable weapons. Charlie walked over to where one of the poles leaned against one wall and stared at it closely. "There are hieroglyphs here, Rosie. What do they say?" Rosie made a quick inspection. "Mainly, they're the symbols of Isis. That means this is definitely the tomb of Osiris, Charlie." Rosie watched, horrified, as Sampson helped himself to a spear. "What are you doing?" she snapped. Sampson paused and turned, staring at her. "Taking some, of course," he replied patronizingly, jabbing the pointed end of one spear in her direction. Her father spoke up in an attempt to avert a new round of arguing. "It might not be a bad thing, Rosie. Those spears should certainly prove effective against any more snakes." Oblivious to what anyone was saying, Sampson gathered up half of the spears, as many as he could carry, as well as some smaller knives. Charlie watched him closely. Whilst he was struggling with his awkward load of weaponry, Charlie noticed that Sampson had temporarily tucked both guns into his belt. Sampson's hands were now full of spears, and he was facing away from him. This was his chance. Charlie's hand slipped down and took hold of the Webley that he had hidden in his clothing. He pulled it out and pointed it directly at Sampson. He cocked the weapon and nervously fingered the trigger. Adrenaline pumped through his body. He had a clear shot. All he had to do was pull the trigger. He started to tremble uncontrollably. In his mind's eye, he imagined that he was in the jungle of his dreams. He aimed carefully and then fired 2 shots in quick succession into Sampson's back at point-blank range. Sampson let out a scream, and his body twisted and convulsed in agony, eventually falling stone dead at Charlie's feet. Reality returned. Charlie knew that it would be easy to kill Sampson, but somehow he couldn't make himself do it. He couldn't move a muscle. All he had to do was pull the trigger, but he couldn't. Something had struck him stiff like a statue. Could he kill a man in cold blood? He looked up and saw that Rosie had now moved across, and his clear shot was now obscured slightly. He relaxed a little, and then replaced the Webley in the rucksack. This was not the time. Fortunately, Sampson had not noticed. No matter, he would have his chance again. He would wait until a better opportunity presented itself. But would he be able to shoot next time? Only time would tell. Although the island containing Osiris's tomb took up a substantial portion of the river, there turned out to be a fairly wide channel to the right, and once they were all back on board, Charlie guided the boat to that side, warily eyeing the shores for any movement. After the dangers they had faced so far, it was difficult to believe that they would pass through this stage without incident. But there was no sign of any other occupants of the chamber except themselves, and finally he allowed himself to relax, paddling almost mindlessly. Sampson craned his neck to look back at the pyramid as they neared the approaching tunnel. "Perhaps on my way back, I'll stop and explore the pyramid some more," he remarked airily. "There could be valuable items farther inside." Amazingly, it was Chatsworth who reacted. "Good. A heavier load will slow you down. Sokar's snakes will have you for tea." There was an ominous silence as Sampson glared at Chatsworth, one hand idly caressing the stock of his revolver, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Chatsworth's stiff back. Rosie's father deliberately refrained from looking around. The silence lengthened and tautened and dribbled into harmless little pieces as Charlie called out, "More light, please." As they entered the tunnel, the lamps duly turned up, Sampson scowled at Chatsworth. "Later, old man," he muttered. "I'll deal with you later." Chatsworth pretended not to hear, instead talking softly with his daughter. She had put down the notebook and was anxiously scanning the walls. For the first time since they had entered the underground caverns, the tunnel walls were marked with pictograms. Rosie pointed to one of the drawings. "Look, there's the sun symbol and the Eye of Ra." Charlie gestured with his oar towards a strange sign which looked a bit like a thatched tower or column. "That's a new one. It's one of the symbols of Osiris, Rosie replied. It's called the Jed, and it's believed to depict the human backbone. It's supposed to provide stability for the soul through the afterlife. They were drawing close to the end of the tunnel, where surprisingly, only one gateway waited. The sun symbol adorned one side of the entry, the Jed the other, and the two symbols together had been painted at the top of the arch. "Why are they next to each other?" Charlie asked. Rosie glanced down at the Amduat, but she had already read this section through several times, worrying over its contents, and really didn't need to refer to it now. "This is the most significant hour, Charlie. In the 6th hour, the Ba, or soul, of Ra unites with his own body, or alternatively, with the Bay of Osiris within the circle formed by the Mahan serpent. So the sun begins its regeneration here at midnight?" She smiled at him despite her disquiet, pleased by his quick comprehension. "You're becoming quite the scholar, Charlie," she teased, trying to stretch the moment before she had to disclose the reason for her worry. Charlie grinned back at her. His thick hair had dried every which way after the chamber of the water spouts, and now stuck up here and there in odd points above a face streaked with dust, sweat, and a few scratches, a few faded bruises from his treatment by Brady's thugs still hanging on. Strangely, this dishevelment only increased his attractiveness. She caught hold of her wandering wits. The sun begins its regeneration here, as Ra begins his upward journey toward morning. Her voice had started to slow over the last few words, and Charlie gave her a concerned look. "That's a good thing, right?" "Yes and no," Rosie admitted. "It means we're halfway there, but there is also great danger. This is Sobek's realm." Charlie had already begun paddling, and Charlie's voice floated back to Rosie. "And who is he, or she?" They turned a corner, and Charlie saw for himself. A giant crocodile some 20 feet long stretched along the length of the riverbank. Even from their current position, Charlie could see that its legs were easily the thickness of tree trunks, and the claws on the large toes had to be at least a foot long. An enormous head turned slowly at the sound of their approach, watching them from luminous great yellow eyes. Rosie was looking down at her book and hadn't seen the creature. Sobek is the crocodile god. He's portrayed as 4 crocodiles who come to attack the deceased souls on their journey through the afterlife. A voice drifted towards them from the front of the boat. "What the hell is that?" Sampson had spotted the crocodile. Charlie was feeling oddly lightheaded. That thing is apparently Sobek, the crocodile god, or at least one of his friends. He glanced around and frowned at Sampson's gun. "I don't think that would be a good idea," remembering something he had read in his grandfather's books. "Why not?" Sampson challenged. Charlie had pulled out his small set of binoculars in order to see the creature more clearly. "Because the scales on that crocodile look extremely thick, and a bullet hitting them would probably have little to no effect. The belly is more likely to be susceptible to damage." "It's lying on its belly," Sampson pointed out, not unreasonably. "Yes." Charlie still sounded abstracted, and Rosie gave him a quick, fearful look. "Charlie, what are you thinking about?" He seemed to come back down to earth and smiled. "Oh, just considering possibilities. Right now, though, I think we should find out whether it's going to let us pass or if it's going to want to have a chat." The lizard's sleepy yellow eyes narrowed at the movement of the boat as Charlie rowed, and it drew closer to the beast. But the crocodile watched, unmoving, as they began to navigate the river in its realm. 1, 2, 3, 4 strokes, and the little boat eased carefully forward as the crocodile remained still. Then it yawned suddenly, the tremendous upper jaw gaping open up towards the roof of the cavern, revealing an army of wickedly long and pointed teeth. They stared at the display, briefly mesmerized by the sheer quantity of dental weaponry. Then the jaws snapped shut with a crack that echoed through the chamber, and the monster's legs bunched as it started to slide down the bank towards the water. The time for subtlety had passed. Charlie dug his oars in hard, paddling violently toward the end of the chamber as Sampson raised his gun, waiting for the monster to expose its belly or any potentially soft spot. Rosie grabbed one of the Isis knives and gripped it firmly, not quite sure what she would do if the necessity arose, but reluctant to be totally unprepared. There was an absurdly small splash as the crocodile entered the water and began swimming almost lazily in their direction. The only part of its body that was visible were its two cavernous nostrils, closing the distance rapidly. Charlie stopped paddling. "We're not going to outrun it," he said abruptly. Rosie stared at him in terror. Just as she thought things couldn't get worse, they did. Charlie stood up in the boat and removed his shirt. "What are you doing, Charlie?" she shouted. "I'm going to wrestle it," he replied nonchalantly and inexplicably. "My grandfather wrestled a giant caiman in Guyana. I'm a waterman, and we face challenges where they stand." "Are you insane?" she hissed, anger rising to mix with her fear. "It will eat you alive." Sampson had listened to the exchange with interest. "Not a bad idea, Waterman," he advised. "Get the beast to rise up to eat you, and I'll get the belly shot. You won't have died in vain." Chatsworth eyed the water, then he handed one of the knives to Charlie. "You'll need this," he said, trying to remain calm as the horrific head approached. Rosie was furious. "Charlie, this is crazy. You can't do it." As if to illustrate her point, she grabbed his oar. "Come on, Father. If we get moving again, we can get away. I know we can." The crocodile ended the debate. The jaws opened hungrily as it approached, and the predatory eyes gleamed. Unmolested, it would have closed its mouth on the side of the boat and simply chomped through it. But Charlie had other plans. With an indeterminate yell, he picked up his oar and dealt a heavy blow to the creature's snout. The head drew back slightly as the crocodile digested this unexpected development. It was accustomed to little, if any, resistance from its occasional prey, and had never experienced being whacked by any large objects, especially on its nose. As the realization that it had been attacked sank in, the crocodile roared in annoyance, and it lunged forward again to renew its onslaught on the hapless boat. Charlie promptly struck it again in precisely the same place. It withdrew again slightly, and he turned toward the others. "Now, start paddling. Let's see how badly it wants us." The crocodile was immense, but not stupid. The wicked eyes slitted, and the great tail began to thrash as the beast began to swim faster. In a matter of seconds, it had regained the distance, and moving past, keeping its snout out of range while its tail, easily capable of smashing the boat to bits all on its own, drew closer. Sampson shouted in frustration as the belly remained underwater, leaving only the resistant scales above the surface, and waited tensely for a chance to shoot. Charlie dropped his oar suddenly and reached down into the boat, scrabbling about until he had found some rope. Looping it over his shoulder, he checked his belt to make sure the Isis knife was secure. Then he turned back to the side and yelled at the crocodile, waving his arms to get its attention. "Hey! Sobek! Over here!" The monster's attention distracted, Charlie stopped jumping around and shouting, and waited until the jaws were even with his part of the boat. Then, with a sudden loud yell, he leaped from the boat, landing on top of the astonished creature's snout, just in front of the cold eyes. Taking advantage of the surprise, Charlie danced over its head and onto its back, where he dropped to his knees and slipped the rope off his shoulder. The crocodile reared its head back in anger, its jaws opening as it sought to locate the intruder. Charlie whipped the rope up and out in a giant loop, and the incensed crocodile closed its mouth around the rope. With all of his strength, Charlie pulled hard at the rope, essentially making a bit, and reins from it as the crocodile cooperated, refusing to let go. It began to whip back and forth, up and down, like a bucking horse, trying to rid itself of the pest on its back. Charlie clutched the rope as tightly as he could as he attempted to stay on. His body flew up and dropped back down, hard as the enormous beast contorted itself. Slowly, painstakingly, each time he landed, he edged to the side so that he landed farther over on his next flight. Eventually, he was close enough to the crocodile's flank to try to locate any softer areas, possibly in the softer crevice where the leg met the torso. He had just spotted one when the crocodile bucked again, and he landed hard enough to see stars. He shook his head to clear it, and saw the smoother skin quite close to his hand. Quickly, he pulled the Isis knife out of his belt and stabbed down viciously. If he had thought the crocodile was annoyed before, now it was definitely angry. Enraged by the sensation of cold metal biting into its flesh, the giant reptile began to buck even harder, twisting its body about, the head whipping around more furiously. Charlie grunted as his abused body absorbed more bruising, but he continued to stab frantically at the vulnerable place, feeling the blood rushing out over his hand. Then the maddened crocodile burst out of the channel altogether, seeming to hang suspended for a moment before it and Charlie crashed back down into and under the water. Realizing at the last minute what was happening, he somehow had the presence of mind to suck in a deep breath. Then the water closed over his head, and he actually found himself rotating underneath the crocodile as it spun crazily. Its own need to breathe saved him. They whooshed back to the surface, and he coughed and gasped for air. Sampson was shouting something and pointing, and after a moment of disbelief, Charlie realized that the monster was facing toward the boat again. If he could just force it to buck upwards again, Sampson might be able to actually get a decent shot. Or shoot me, he thought sourly. But the crocodile was beginning its dance once more, and he realized that if the crocodile won, it wouldn't matter what Sampson did. He plunged the knife back into its armpit, tearing and ripping, pushing it farther in each time, and the crocodile roared in pain. It started thrashing harder and harder, and Charlie's grunts of pain were rapidly becoming groans, his bruises acquiring bruises of their own. The arm holding the rope was taking more punishment, and his shoulder felt in danger of dislocating. This was too much. He refused to give in to a crocodile, no matter how big it was. He closed his eyes for a moment and imagined his grandfather wrestling down the caiman, triumphing over it. He was a waterman. He would fight like one. Charlie brought his right hand down with punishing speed and stabbed the crocodile with every ounce of strength in his body, so hard that the crocodile froze in mid-thrash, shocked by the impact. For a minute, the great belly was exposed, and Sampson took advantage of the opportunity. The roar of the revolver echoed the crocodile's growl, and was in turn echoed by its scream as the bullets found their way unerringly into the soft flesh of its belly and its heart. Frozen anew, it hung suspended momentarily as the crocodile absorbed the extent of the damage. Then it sank down into the water, so quickly that Charlie found himself caught on its back, still clutching the now useless rope. Dazed by the rapid descent, he continued to hold on until he realized what had happened, and that he was in danger of dying himself if he didn't start swimming. Body aching, the pain in his shoulder a clear indication that it was indeed dislocated, he began kicking, pulling himself upward with his right arm, hoping he was somewhere close to the boat. He wasn't sure if he would be able to swim much farther if he wasn't. He was in luck. He surfaced not quite an oar's distance away, and there was Rosie, her face anxious, holding one out to him. Somehow he made it to the oar and clutched at it right-handed, treading water while he gathered the last bit of strength he could muster. Thankfully, she sensed his weakness, and she and her father began pulling the oar back, bringing him along with it until he was able to hook one elbow over the side of the boat. He stopped there, unable to make his aching body move any farther. Rosie gave Sampson a pleading look. "Could you please come help us?" she asked desperately. Pleased with his performance, Sampson was in a mood to be magnanimous. He put his gun down carefully and stepped over. Between the three of them, they heaved Charlie over the side and into the boat, where he lay limply, his injured shoulder at a strange angle. His face had been washed clean of the dust, but acquired a few more scrapes, several of which were oozing blood, and he was clearly in pain. But the insouciant grin reappeared briefly as he looked across at Sampson. "Good shooting," he said reluctantly, and then lost consciousness. "Charlie, you're back," Rosie said, somewhat unnecessarily. "You've been out for a while?" He was still taking stock. The pain in his shoulder had lessened, too, from sharp shrieking to a dull roar, and he deduced that it had been straightened while he was unconscious, for which he was grateful. He had dislocated it when he was younger, and the repair was not an experience he would have looked forward to with any enthusiasm. His face felt sore, and his hands had been burned by the rope. Otherwise, there was no single specific complaint, but his body felt like he had fallen off of a horse and then been kicked thoroughly. He wasn't sure he could take on any more monsters in the immediate future, and said something to that effect. "No more heroic battles for an hour or so, okay, Rosie?" Rosie paled, the faint golden freckles popping out in vivid contrast to the lack of color. "Well, I wish I could say that the next chamber will be easier. The next chamber contains Ra's main adversary. It's a monster serpent." Charlie sighed a little, and then went silent. Rosie held up the Amduat. "The 7th hour is when Ra meets Apep, or Apophis, the great enemy. Apep was Ra's brother, and jealous of Ra's supreme power, so he adopted the night as his realm in conflict with Ra's rule over the day. After Ra's regeneration, he had to defend himself against Apep's threat." Charlie closed his eyes in a futile attempt to ease his throbbing head. "Does it say how we can kill him?" "Yes, it does." Her tone was a little more hopeful. The companions were ready for Apep, and they thrust sharp knives and spears at him, knocking him off the side back into the water. "Well, it's a good job we brought these along," said Sampson smugly, holding up a spear. The boat suddenly stopped, and Charlie pulled himself upright so he could get a better view, then he wished he hadn't. Facing the hapless boat was a monster even more frightening than the crocodile. It was an enormous snake. The dully shining scales seemed to fill the chamber as the snake rose impossibly high, its head almost brushing the rocky ceiling of the tunnel. Black eyes the size of small plates fixed their flat, opaque stare on the newcomers as if debating whether their intrusion warranted immediate action and the degree of severity it should involve. Without really thinking about what he was doing, Charlie inched his hand towards one of the Isis spears, and the snake's gaze immediately shifted to track the movement. A forked tongue, easily the size of a man of normal height, flicked out of the triangular snout, the mouth opening to reveal 2 mountain-sized fangs on either side of the tongue. This wasn't good. Charlie let his gaze roam slowly over the available weaponry. Then he returned his focus to the snake. As if divining Charlie's thoughts, Chatsworth pulled his own fascinated, terrified gaze away from the snake and nodded. The snake is a reptile just like the crocodile, and as such is vulnerable where there are no scales to protect it. "That's what I was thinking," Charlie replied. "But if you think I'm wrestling with that thing, you can bugger off. I've done my bit for today." Chatsworth interrupted. "I think I can sort this one out myself, Charlie." There was a snort from Sampson. "Sort it out yourself? Fat lot of use you'd be, old man." Chatsworth retorted angrily. "I'm actually a fair hand at throwing a knife. I suggest we stay as far as we can out of immediate range at first. Use the knives as darts, and then Sampson can have a pot shot at it as well. Although with the amount of whiskey that he's poured down his neck, I doubt he'll hit anything." "Then we go in at close range with the spears," Charlie finished excitedly. "That might work, Moses. We may just have a chance." Sampson eyed Rosie's father doubtfully. "Just how good are you at knife throwing, old man?" Rosie grinned. "Good enough to win prizes at the county fair every year." Charlie was still distracted by the logistics. Chatsworth's idea had merit, but would it work? Could it work? On the other hand, no acceptable alternatives were coming to mind. The snake effectively blocked their passage through the chamber. "Okay, let's do it." He inched his head sideways to see if the snake would react. At the movement, the snake began to sway in the same direction and tracked Charlie's similar movement to the other side as well. Charlie rubbed his chin and eyed the monster thoughtfully. Its unblinking gaze was disconcerting. Man and snake contemplated each other for a few minutes as time seemed to stretch out and pause, perhaps waiting for one of them to make a decision. The snake broke first. The carpet that was its tongue flicked out and back in with surprising speed for its size, accompanied by a hiss like a steam locomotive. Charlie instinctively flinched back, just missing being struck by a large glob of saliva that hit the boat and sizzled. "Jesus!" Chatsworth exclaimed, reaching frantically for several of the knives as Sampson hefted his revolver upwards in panic and aimed. "On 3 then. Fire as I throw. Charlie, do you think you can get it to raise itself up a bit more?" Charlie looked at him incredulously. "What do you mean, raise itself up a bit more? It almost had me that time." "All right then, 1 roof-high snake, coming up." Charlie began to wave his arms around. "Hoi, Apep, Apophis, whatever your name is." Surprisingly, the snake chose to take umbrage at being shouted at. It hissed again and obligingly rose even higher. Without removing his attention from the wedge-shaped head moving ominously from side to side, Charlie called out, "High enough, Moses." "Yes," Chatsworth said tightly. "Sampson, on my mark." He raised 2 knives and waited for Sampson's grunt of assent. 1, 2, 3. Sampson pulled his trigger repeatedly, the bullets punching into the snake's soft throat and underside. There were simultaneous flashes of silver as Chatsworth threw first 2, then 2 more of the sacred knives in an X pattern around the bullet holes. Without stopping to check his progress, Chatsworth scooped up 4 more knives and threw again with equally deadly accuracy. The snake reared back, roaring with fury and pain. "Now, Charlie, the spears!" Charlie grabbed one in each hand and stood up, keeping his knees bent to steady himself in the boat, Rosie following his lead. As Chatsworth moved the oars to hold the boat steady, the monster snake leaned towards them again to attack. Charlie shoved his spears at the beast, slicing into the soft flesh. The snake bellowed again and began to thrash about. Rosie seized the opportunity offered by its lower belly, moving closer and struck in her turn, frantically ripping through the soft skin. But the snake unexpectedly whipped its head around and struck at her. Charlie dived across just at the last minute to save her. He had to think quickly, and with no other option available, he punched the snake in the head with his bare fist. The snake, in its death throes, with its mouth gaping wide upon, tried its best to bite down on Rosie's leg. Had it not been for Charlie's punch, the snake would have bit the leg clean off at the knee. As it was, the fangs only grazed her leg. However, they still drew a spurt of blood, and Rosie screamed out in pain. The bite was only a glancing one, and the snake had lost all sense of malicious intent, being only concerned with defending itself against these puny beings with their sharp objects which burned its entrails. It reared up once more and flung itself downward, opening its mouth wide as if to swallow the boat and its occupants whole. Charlie yelled indistinctly and thrust up with all his strength, embedding one of the spears in the snake's soft palate and upwards into its brain. The beast screamed in anguish as it hung, impaled by the sacred points, and time seemed to stop. Then, with a twisting movement that almost lifted Charlie up with the spears, he let go. The snake convulsed, still screaming, and sank equally abruptly into the water, its head coming to rest just above the surface. The black eyes slowly dimmed from opaque to totally lightless as the giant reptile's last movements slowed and stilled until it failed to move at all. Panting, Charlie stared down at it, wondering if it was dead. Rosie voiced the thought for him. "Did we kill it, Charlie?" The only motion in the water was the dying wavelets from the snake's thrashing. As Charlie watched, even these stopped. "I think so, Rosie," he replied slowly, his head beginning to throb again as the adrenaline rush faded. He came over to attend to her wound. Not surprisingly, Chatsworth was fussing around her already and was plainly distraught with worry. "I think she'll be all right, Mr. Chatsworth. The big snakes are usually not venomous," said Charlie. He moved over to where Rosie was laying and cradled her head. She smiled back and held his hand. Sampson had reloaded his gun and was spinning the chamber. "Let's hope you're right, Waterman," he said, with no concern for the injured girl. "We might still need her." The 8th and 9th hours of their journey through the subterranean tunnels passed without incident. After the lengthy battle with the snake, every muscle in Charlie's body ached. His jaw throbbed where he had been unconsciously clenching it, both from tension and from the strain of refraining from whacking Sampson once and for all with the business end of the paddle. Now, all he wanted to do was stop moving for a few minutes and let his mind go blank. It wouldn't hurt to take a break, and he made an arbitrary decision. "Time for a rest. We'll continue on in 10 minutes. Sampson spoke up right on cue. "Why are we stopping?" he demanded. Charlie sighed. "Unless you want to take a turn at the oars, this rest stop is not negotiable." Sampson muttered under his breath for a minute, then said grudgingly, "Okay, 10 minutes, and I'll keep track of the time." He pulled out his watch and opened it ostentatiously, then annoyingly proceeded to count down the minutes out loud. After 7 minutes, Charlie was more than ready to start again, if for no other reason than to shut the other man up. And they set off again into the darkness. Rosie consulted the amduat at the gates to the 10th hour, and after reading through the next section, she made a small sound of dismay. "I think this next part of the journey may turn out to be rather damp again. The inscription for the 10th hour refers to regenerating waters, which I believe refers to Ra's regeneration before emerging triumphantly from his night's journey." She dithered for a moment, deciding which door to take, but the amduat was not clear, and she had nothing more concrete than a vague feeling. She had to decide quickly, as they couldn't exactly remain where they were. Finally, slowly, she replied, "The right-hand gate is the one we need to take, but be careful." As they rounded the second twist in the channel after going through the gate, the lazy cross-current that had begun to tug at Charlie's oars strengthened. Slowly, he became aware of the familiar sound of rushing water, although not as thunderous as the area of the waterspouts. Ahead, he could see spray flying, which increased in density and intensity as they approached. At the same time, his oars began actively fighting his attempts to keep the boat sailing forward, and an uncomfortable thought began to take shape in the back of his mind. Chatsworth, equally beset, made the mental leap first. "Whirlpool!" he exclaimed. "Charlie, we need to stay at the very top of the curve or we'll be sucked in." Charlie was paddling as hard as he could, his face grim. "I don't know if we'll have a choice, sir," he said shortly. "It's too big, and the current's very strong. Perhaps if we all paddle, we may have a chance." He raised his voice and called to Rosie and Sampson. "Take the spare oars. Rosie, stroke with your father. Sampson, with me. It's the only chance we have." Sampson caught the oar that Rosie heaved at him before it smacked him in the face. He glared at her, then the boat dipped suddenly, and he got a good look at the monstrous eddy roiling before them, an enormous round blackness in its center. Finally impressed by the possibility of imminent demise, he dipped and paddled for all he was worth, finally acting in agreement with the woman he despised. It didn't matter. The giant whirlpool was relentless. The lamps soon got waterlogged and went out, leaving the chamber was in total darkness. Despite their efforts, the small party was unable to prevent, or even effectively slow, their progress toward the center of the whirlpool. Every time Charlie thought they had succeeded in starting to climb towards the outer ring, another current slashed viciously against the boat, shoving it back towards certain doom as easily as if it were made of paper, and their oars were mere twigs. Each such thrust was accompanied by a wave briefly submerging the craft, and within seconds he was drenched, gasping for air, exhausted muscles bunching with the effort to remain afloat. A small corner of his mind wondered at the Amduat's choice of wording. If this was regeneration, did that mean he actually had to drown? They were inevitably sliding towards the middle. Even as Charlie fought the last homicidal current, a new wall of water loomed ahead, stretching foaming arms towards them. He bellowed at it, mustering all the defiance he could command, and dug his oar deep, but it wasn't enough. The boat rammed into the wall, or perhaps was rammed by it, he wasn't sure, but the effect was the same. Slowly, agonizingly, they tipped to the inside, Rosie and Sampson watching their oars rise into the air. Then the boat turned turtle as it hurtled down, flinging its passengers in all directions, and followed them into the gaping blackness at the center. Through the darkness, Charlie had a brief glimpse of Sampson and Chatsworth hitting the water close together, too far away for him to reach either one before he was pulled downward. Frantically, he grabbed in the direction Rosie had last been, and miraculously found her searching hand, seeking his with equal desperation. They clung to each other as the water yanked and pushed them along, still deeper than Charlie would have liked, in this green-black murk that had not seen a glimmer of light in 4,000 years, and which was close to impenetrable by the naked eye. Then they were sucked down further into the darkness of the swirling abyss. His lungs were close to bursting when the force of the current suddenly pushed them upward. As one, he and Rosie began swimming, harder than either had ever done before, allowing the change in direction to help them along. Just as despair tried to edge its way past determination, Charlie's straining hand broke the surface and smacked against the side of the boat. With one last surge of strength, he shoved himself up, out of the water, hauling Rosie up next to him. Clinging to the boat for support, they gasped for air in whooping bursts, bodies shaking with the effort of calming oxygen-starved lungs. After a few moments, Charlie raised his head and looked around. In the dim light, he could see that Sampson was bobbing up and down in the water a short distance from them. Chatsworth was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Moses?" Charlie yelled, as he stared around at the water, trying to see through the impossible gunk. "He can't swim!" Sampson reached the boat and hung onto it, breathing heavily. "I didn't see him!" The lack of concern in his voice was clear, and Charlie and Rosie both stared at him. "What do you mean?" Rosie demanded. "I saw you before we were pulled under, and he was right there next to you." Charlie was still surveying the water, looking for bubbles, movement, anything which would give him an idea where Chatsworth might be. If the old man had kept his wits about him and simply concentrated on holding his breath, he might have been able to survive this latest disaster, at least long enough to be retrieved. Charlie lowered himself back into the water, searching the dimness until he had to surface for air. Once, twice, 3 times. He was going back down when he heard Rosie's choked sob. "Oh God, no!" Hastily turning, Charlie saw a limp hand floating towards him. A second look showed Chatsworth's body attached to it, face down, the other arm outstretched in the typical posture of a drowned man. He hurriedly stroked over to the dead man and turned him over, hoping somehow to find breath in him, but his searching fingers found no evidence of a pulse in Chatsworth's throat, and Charlie's attempts at reviving him were fruitless. Gently, he brushed the staring eyes closed before towing the body over to the boat so that Rosie wouldn't have to see her father's terrified gaze. As it was, she practically flung herself on top of the drowned man in her sorrow, cuddling his head to her breast and sobbing quietly. Charlie was distraught also. Chatsworth was dead, and it was his fault. Charlie had forced the old man to come along on this adventure against his will. He had cajoled him in Gibraltar, taking advantage of the old man's interest in sundials and astronomy to get him to tag along. He had stolen his digging permit and then taken him away from his work at Giza, a place that he would now never return to. He had forced him down into an underground tunnel system, knowing that he couldn't swim. It was Charlie's fault that he was now dead. Charlie had killed him. There was no question about that. Charlie felt guilty. He had given no real thought to anyone else's feelings since he started this trip, and now 2 people were dead. Charlie gave Sampson a telling glance and said quietly, "Help me turn the boat over so we can take stock." It was more of an order than a request, but Sampson for once held his peace. With some pushing and pulling, they finally succeeded in returning the boat to its normal position. By some miracle, almost all their gear had survived, and Charlie once again found himself grateful to Max for insisting on water-resistant wrappings and showing him how to lash everything down well before the wisdom of such a course became obvious. Ironically, the only gear which had not remained intact belonged to Chatsworth. Charlie managed to relight one of the lamps and leaned over the side of the boat to where Rosie was still paddling and cuddling her father's body. "Rosie?" he asked tentatively. Even though her face was wet from their unplanned swim, the streaks of tears were obvious. My father felt that he was a small man and nobody was interested in him. But I was Charlie. To me, he was everything. She snuffled a little, shaking her head. He was everything that he could possibly have been. We may not have had money, even if other people thought he was a bit of a twit. He loved me so much, and I loved him dearly. "What am I going to do, Charlie?" He wasn't sure if she wanted an answer, so he waited, reaching down to help support Chatsworth's body. "This is my fault, Rosie," he said. "I shouldn't have got him involved on this trip." Rosie sobbed. "No, Charlie. I've never seen him happier than these last few days. Don't blame yourself. He was old, but he wouldn't have missed this for the world. Believe me." Rosie's words were of some comfort to Charlie, but he still felt bad about the whole thing. He was about to suggest that perhaps they should turn back when Sampson, reliably ill-timed, spoke up. "Time's passing, and we need to carry on." Rosie bit back her first thought and looked at Charlie instead. "I know we can't take Father with us," she said slowly. Charlie winced. "I won't force you to leave him if you don't want to." She shook her head. "No, Charlie. This may be a good place. These are the waters of regeneration, after all. It will be his soul that makes the rest of the journey, and I just have to trust that Osiris will look upon him kindly." She leaned down and kissed her father's face, quietly telling him goodbye, then released her hold on his body, letting it float in the water. Without speaking, she took Charlie's helping hand and climbed up into the boat, but not without one sizzling, ominous glare at Sampson as he resumed his seat. "You could have saved him!" she shouted out loudly. "I'll kill you for this," she thought vengefully, as she settled herself and picked up her oar, the Amduat and its challenges temporarily forgotten in her rage. As if by way of a strange cosmic apology, the remaining hours were relatively quiet. The largest challenge, contained in the 11th chamber, was a series of labyrinthine passages which wound around several turns in the river. Presumably once large enough to conceal the pattern of waterways, the island sands had eroded over the passing centuries, and the small remnants of land no longer obscured the traveler's view. Charlie paddled almost absently through the maze, barely paying attention to where he was going. Rosie huddled over her oar even more mechanically, weeping noiselessly. Sampson, for once, remained silent as the boat slid along. The 12th hour was equally subdued, marked only by the arrival of a mass of large scorpions along their route. Charlie smacked a few with his oar and waited to see how the others would react. Predictably, the remaining creatures followed suit, swarming towards the boat. Charlie watched them steadily. Although the insects were bigger than the usual variety, after dealing with Sobek and Apep, he wasn't particularly impressed by their size, and they quickly set about squashing them with their oars. Eventually, they were free and proceeded further down the tunnel. Rosie exclaimed, "We should be almost through the underground caverns now, Charlie." "What happens then?" She turned a page. We should exit the waterway through a snake's head into the eastern horizon. He sighed. More snakes? No, probably just a stone archway, Rosie replied absently. It symbolizes being ready to rise again as the new day's sun and the end of our journey. About time, Sampson grunted. And there, Charlie thought as he paddled, was yet another problem. The sooner they finished the journey, the closer they got to being shot. Would Sampson wait until they had reached the treasure before taking drastic action? Charlie mulled the matter over for a short distance and decided he would make one more try at convincing Sampson to change his mind. If it didn't work, he was going to have to make a move and try to wrest Sampson's guns away from him. He took a deep breath. Mr. Sampson. It was as if Sampson had read his mind. Don't even think you can dissuade me from my plan, Waterman. Surely he hadn't been that transparent. Oh, come on, Sampson, Charlie exclaimed. After all that we've endured on this journey together, who kept you from becoming lunch for that snake, for instance? Doesn't that change anything? No, not really, Sampson said coldly. I still intend to be the only one to leave, and with the treasure. The only reason that you and that harpy are still alive is because you can make it easier for me. Rosie started to turn around. Charlie laid a hand on her arm to stop her. Not now, Rosie. She jerked away from his touch. Yes, now. She stood up suddenly, rocking the boat violently, and made a lurch towards Sampson with her oar. Sampson was taken by surprise and for a moment didn't know what to do. He raised his gun almost half-heartedly to shoot her, but did nothing. Taking advantage of Sampson's momentary lapse of concentration, Charlie decided to act also and launched himself onto the other man in a flying leap. As he fell on him with his full body weight, he hit Sampson's arm, knocking the gun out of his hand and sending it clattering to the bottom of the boat. Rosie dropped the oar and dived for the gun as the two men wrestled, the boat rocking alarmingly as they fought. Her fingers closed on the gun just as Sampson hit Charlie in the face, sending him stumbling backwards, Sampson leaping after him. Sampson went to pull another gun from his belt, but he lost his grip on it as Charlie whacked him with an oar, and the gun fell over the side and into the water with a loud splash. "Stop right there!" a voice commanded. The voice was icy cold, and both combatants froze, gazing at her in astonishment. Rosie held Sampson's gun in a surprisingly steady hand, aiming it at its former owner. Neither man moved as she edged back, her free hand rummaging in Charlie's pack until it emerged with a revolver of its own. She tossed the Webley to Charlie, who managed to break his paralysis and catch it. Still shocked by Rosie's actions, he cocked the pistol and aimed it at Sampson as well. Sampson stared at them for a moment, then began to laugh. Charlie and Rosie exchanged a quick glance of confusion before returning their focus to Sampson. "Just what's so funny?" Rosie demanded angrily. Still laughing, Sampson started to speak. He looked at Rosie. "It would be ironic now, wouldn't it? To be shot with the gun that my own father used to kill himself. Or to be shot with my grandfather's gun," Charlie added. "In any case, you die," Charlie shouted, thinking desperately, hoping to come up with a plan. "Come on, Charlie," Sampson needled. "Get it over with, why don't you?" Charlie's hesitation only encouraged him further. "What's wrong with you? Aren't you man enough?" Charlie heard Max's voice in his mind's ear. "That bandit would have killed us all. I could see it in his eyes." Would he see murder in Sampson's? He looked hard at the other man, but saw nothing he could make sense of, only some small, pitiable object. He lowered the Webley slightly, and Sampson laughed again. "You're a coward, Charlie." Charlie's hand twitched upward just a little. "I'm no different to you, Sampson. You couldn't kill anyone. You could have killed us all before if you had wanted to." "You're a fool, Waterman. Killing is second nature to me. How do you think your grandfather died?" A nasty little smirk traveled over Sampson's face as he met Charlie's incredulous eyes. Time stopped for a moment as his words sunk in. "What do you mean?" Charlie said slowly, aiming the gun again and gripping it tighter. The other man shook his head. "Come on, Charlie. Don't be so slow on the uptake. You don't think your grandfather fell out of that tree on his own, do you? Ignoring Charlie's slow burn, he continued, I waited high up in the branches for him. The old fool didn't see me until it was too late, and it was an easy thing for me to force that feeble old man off the branch. Charlie still said nothing, and Sampson went on gleefully. His bones cracked like twigs when he hit the ground, and he hit his head hard on the roots. I knew no one would find him soon enough, so I left him to die. The tears were starting to blur Charlie's vision, but he could still see Sampson well enough to shoot him. Are you saying that you killed my grandfather? Sampson merely sniggered, and Charlie cocked the Webley again, his finger starting to tighten on the trigger as sweat broke out on his forehead from the effort of trying to keep it steady. The unpleasant grin on Sampson's face almost undid him. Luckily, just before he reached the point of no return, Charlie heard his grandfather's voice in his head. Life is precious, Charlie. Always remember that. Charlie relaxed his trigger finger and lowered the gun. You go ahead and think me a coward, Sampson, but I am better than you. Much better than you. I could kill you if I wanted to, but I pity you. Instead, I'm going to turn you into the police when we get out of here. A life sentence in prison will be more punishment than a bullet in the head. What a noble gesture, Sampson scoffed. And what about your little friend here? Does she feel the same? Not in the least. If you can't kill him, Charlie, I bloody well will. Eyes wild, her whole body shaking, and with her attention riveted on Sampson, she pulled her trigger. The loud bang of the revolver echoed around the enclosed chamber. Sampson screamed out in pain as the bullet ripped into his flesh. She'd shot him in the head, but her hand was shaking too much for any degree of accuracy. The shot merely grazed Sampson's cheek and ricocheted off the stone ceiling, leaving Rosie shocked and breathless. Charlie stepped in. He's not worth it, Rosie. He deserves to pay in prison. Give me the gun. She shook her head in defiance, readying for another shot, but her body was starting to go into shock, and Charlie knew the moment of crisis had passed. His own gun, still pointing at Sampson, was enough to discourage any rash action. Charlie soothed Rosie until she relented. She finally gave him the revolver, but quickly reached down into the boat for some rope. Okay, but I'm tying the bastard up so that he can't do anything. Sampson made no attempt to resist. Shocked from being shot and bleeding profusely from the large wound to his cheek, he appeared subdued. Charlie resisted any trickle of sympathy. This man had terrorized them since they entered the tunnels and had been quite willing to see them all dead. He had also killed his beloved grandfather. Rosie tied him up and then stared down at Sampson with contempt. Stay there, you bastard, and don't move. I won't miss next time. She laughed at the sudden look of terror in Sampson's eyes, and Charlie took her arm gently. Keep the gun aimed at him, Rosie. It's not over yet. We've still got farther to go, remember? He coaxed her back to her place, and he began to paddle again, aiming at the faint light at the end of the chamber. It grew steadily until they found themselves traveling through a stone representation of a snake's head, turning them out at a wide landing stage at the Hall of Final Judgment. Charlie reached out to steady the boat as they pulled up to the landing stage and tied it up at his end as Rosie jumped out lightly to secure the other. The boat secure, the two young people began unloading important items from the boat, ignoring Sampson, who continued to hunch at his end. That bastard should carry some of this stuff, Rosie said disgustedly. Charlie shook his head. No, we'd have to untie him. He put his arm around her shoulder and pulled her close to him, giving her a reassuring squeeze. We'd better keep him tied up and watch him closely. He walked back over to the boat and unceremoniously hauled him from it, dumping him onto the landing. Rosie stood silently, the revolver in her hand, as she watched them. All right, Sampson. You're going to go first. If you try to do anything tricky, Rosie will shoot you, and you'll be flat on your back in no time. Sampson didn't bother to respond, but began moving off toward a stone doorway. Charlie followed, somewhat surprised at himself. Where had this new Charlie come from? He had started this journey kind, carefree, happy-go-lucky, or at least, he had been. Along the way, he had been tested, and some of his softer edges had annealed. He hoped not to the extent of a Sampson. He sighed and put thoughts of self-evaluation aside for the time being. They still had far to go on their quest, and more immediate matters to face. One thing was troubling him more than anything, though. He had had the chance to shoot Sampson himself, but had done nothing. Rosie spoke. This hall is where the traveling soul would face the 42 divine judges and plead their innocence of any wrongdoing during their lifetime. She couldn't help a glare in Sampson's direction, but continued in the same even tone. The Book of the Dead provides the correct words to use for each of the judges, so that this part of the judgment process could be passed even if the soul was not entirely innocent. Rosie looked around the chamber, counting under her breath. 40, 41, 42. These are the divine judges, Charlie. They're 42 doors leading into 42 different chambers. But only one of them is the right door. Once we've picked a door, there's no coming back. She began to walk down the hall, looking closely at each door. Each one featured a different god or hieroglyph, and she recited them aloud as she went. Ra, Horus, Apophis, Hathor, Seti, Isis, Osiris. Charlie, it has to be this one, the one with the sign of Osiris. All right, he agreed, and pulled on Sampson's rope. After you. Cautiously, Sampson moved through the door opening, holding his breath, certain that something disastrous would happen. Nothing did. But as they all entered the chamber, a stone doorway slid unnoticed into place behind them, blocking their exit. With a feeling almost of anticlimax, the trio continued on, through a small antechamber which led into a larger room. Along the walls was a spectacular painting, and they stopped and stared at it in awe. She took a breath. Then she began to explain the painting, pointing as she did so. This is the weighing of the heart ceremony. The heart was believed to contain a record of all of the soul's actions during his lifetime, so it was weighed against the feather of the goddess Ma'at. The feather symbolizes truth and justice, so it was used to determine whether the person had been virtuous or not. All right, Charlie said. And that's Anubis, with the soul? Rosie nodded. And the one with the bird's head, an ibis actually, is Thoth, the god of wisdom. It was his responsibility to record the result of the weighing. Sampson was looking at the beast crouching underneath the scales. And just who or what is that? Rosie flashed him a glance and said viciously, That's Ammit, the devourer of the dead. She gets to eat the heart if it outweighs the feather of truth, and the soul dies the final, complete death. Charlie intervened before she could elaborate with a comparison of Sampson to the evil soul. So, we can expect some sort of test, Rosie? They had been walking along the length of the mural as she talked, and they reached the end of the chamber, where another archway led to another small, narrow chamber. Rosie pointed into it. This is it, Charlie, the end of the journey. Once we pass through this final portal, we'll be in the field of rushes. Her eyes were shining. Just think, Charlie, the tomb of destiny, where the pharaohs rest for eternity. Charlie poked his head into the chamber. There was barely room for him, and certainly not enough for the three of them. 3 stone levers rested on the opposite wall, otherwise the room was bare. Rosie inched her head in to have a look, temporarily forgetting about Sampson. Those levers are symbolic of weighing the heart, Charlie. If we pick the right one, we can go through. He rubbed his chin, thinking, what if we pick the wrong one? She shivered. Well, according to the Book of the Dead, then the heart is eaten by Ammit and we go to hell, or some equivalent disaster befalls us. Rosie consulted the Amduat. It also says that if the scales balance, the soul passes the test and is taken before Osiris, who welcomes them into the afterlife. She gave Charlie a small push. Let me take a closer look, Charlie. He backed out of the chamber so she could get closer to the wall with the levers, watching closely as she examined each one in turn, each time checking the amduat. Finally, she pointed at one of the levers. "It's this one." "All right," Charlie agreed. His confidence in Rosie's judgment was absolute. "Let's give it a go then." Rosie lifted her hand and started to reach for the lever when a voice rang out behind them. "Stop right where you are and don't move a muscle." Charlie bumped into Rosie suddenly. When she turned, she saw Sampson, somehow free of his ropes and with his gun back in his hand. The same gun struck Charlie from behind, dazing him. He rubbed at his head blurrily, trying to regain his balance. "What the hell?" he began fuzzily, still dazed. Sampson laughed and waved his gun at them. "Thanks to Miss Chatsworth here, I now know which lever to press to reach the treasure and succeed with my plan, so I don't need you two anymore. You're both infatuated with the underworld. Now it's time for you to study it more closely." Sampson raised the gun, cocked the trigger, and pointed it at them both. Rosie let out a small scream and grabbed Charlie, who was swaying alarmingly, clutching him tightly in her distress. Charlie tried desperately to focus his eyes, to get a clearer view of what looked like multiple Sampsons. A small, perverse corner of his mind wondered idly what it would be like to die, and he saw his short life flash by quickly. Surprisingly, even though he was holding Rosie, all he could think about was Victoria and his father. He grimaced and made a last-ditch effort to pull himself together, tensing his muscles to jump. As he started to move, a gunshot rang out. Charlie closed his eyes and flinched, expecting to feel a bullet tearing into his soft flesh, but nothing happened.